So I thought I should probably clarify that when I named my presentation Old Dogs, New Tricks, that I wasn't thinking of any of you. I thought, except for maybe Bill Houlihan, I was kind of thinking of you, actually. All right, so I thought that it might make sense for me to just give a little bit of my background because, you know, what I have to say comes from a perspective, and it is, of course, informed by my professional experience. So I have a private practice. I'm a sole practitioner. This is my only coworker. I do about half mediation and half arbitration. I got my start, as Bill did, in mediating and arbitrating labor relations disputes. I now also mediate and arbitrate individual employment cases. I do some mediation in the family law area, so property division, child custody and placement issues. And I do some work in the securities area, which I still can't fully understand. So I would like to, I know it's late in the afternoon, and I thought to wake us up a little bit, I would have a couple videos. So I'm kind of a movie nut. And this should get us started. Jane.
Is it here? If you play it off of here, there's quite a delay. So what I would do is just click escape and then pull it up
Oh.
in Safari.
Okay.
That's what I was doing.
Oh, I thought.
So give it a second, yep, and then just pull it up in Chrome or whatever browser you like.
So will it automatically? No, so it won't come up through the PowerPoint.
It will. It just takes a good. Remember when it's the second.
The
video
spinning,
started?
let's try that because
takes a
I really don't want to get the wrong version. So Christina, do you know,
If you just click on whatever you hyperlinked,
it's supposed to be embedded. This is going really well as a technology presentation so far.
It doesn't look like there's a hyperlink there.
It's perfect. This is actually one of the things that I'm going to say later not to do. So. We should.
That's the problem,
All right, well, I thought it was embedded, but I'm going to skip that then. That's all right. That's all right. We can move on. Okay. Well, the point with the video is one that is a very funny scene from a movie called Boogie Nights, which is a wonderful and I think really important American movie. If anyone wants to talk about it later, it's a little off track, but I think it's a really important movie about families, actually, how good families are made. But in this particular scene, Don Cheadle is trying to sell a stereo to this customer. And he's talking about high fidelity, and he's trying to impress him with his technical expertise. And he says that high fidelity are two very important things to have in a stereo. And he refers to the TK421 as being another high-tech feature that this customer has to have, and he totally alienates him when he walks out the door. My point in showing the video is that I do not intend to suggest to any of you that you need hi-fi in your stereos. I don't really want to introduce the TK421 into your mediation techniques. What I really want to do is talk about the everyday tools. Nah, the button's not working. I got it. Can I just go to that? All right, and you can do it from current slide, the second one. There you go, perfect, thank you. It'll come up. Okay, so what I want to talk to you about are the tools of technology that we use every single day and how we use them in our practices. I'm going to focus on these a little bit out of order, but telephone, email, text messaging, and video conferencing, probably telephone is one that I'll touch on the least. So I think that we can all acknowledge that there may be occasions during a mediation session when technology may come into play as a way to communicate with participants in mediation who can't be present. Maybe a school district representative or a parent is ill and wants to participate but can't participate in person. Maybe there's a disability involved on the parent's part that it prohibits them from being present. We've talked about parents who live far away. We've talked about parents who are incarcerated. And I've actually done some video conferencing work, not in these cases, but in another type of case with participants who are incarcerated, and we've used video conferencing. We'll get to that a little bit more. So that's during a mediation session. There are also these interactions in the pre-mediation session experiences that we have, sometimes the post-mediation sessions, and sometimes interactions with parties between sessions. And I think, unless it's an exceptional situation, those nearly always require some form of technology. So we're communicating with parties via email typically. My first contact with parties is typically via email. Certainly by telephone if we have pre-mediation discussions with them. Sometimes text messaging can become involved. And I actually have been interacting with professionals recently where the only way they communicate, it seems to me, is through video conferencing. So we don't have telephone calls. Every time we talk about our committee's work, we do it through video conferencing. So any of these forms of technology can and will come into play when we're communicating with parties, again, during periods that are not the mediation session. All of these forms of technology have a kind of contextual influence in our communications that I think require us to be very deliberate about how we use them, that require us to make careful choices and to be strategic about how we use them. So the examples that I will get into are from special ed cases. They're from some other cases where I think the example carries over really well to the special ed setting. And I hope for us to fill up 2 hours, we're going to need to have a discussion about this. I hope that you all will start to think about the experiences that you've had and be willing to bring those into our discussion. Because really the only way we can figure out how this all works is through these specific examples. Okay, so I want to start with a couple models, and then I'm going to get into some specifics. This is the first one. So this is a communication model that was developed by a psychologist who I think is still at UCLA in emeritus status, Albert Mehrabian. The model was actually developed in the 1960s. And the suggestion, and I know this is hard to read, the suggestion is that, oh, that's right, the PowerPoint is in there. So the suggestion is that under this communication model, 7% of what is communicated, the thin slice, is the verbal communication, the words that we actually use. 38% is nonverbal communication. It's the way that we say things. Tone, volume, pauses, and then 55% is visual communication. So it's the kind of behaviors that we engage in when we're communicating, this sort of conduct. This is referred to in this model as the 738-55 rule. I want to be really careful about this. Aptly named. I want to be careful about this because this model is actually, and some of you may have a professional background where you know more about this than I do. The model has been misapplied in a number of circumstances. So it's used in communication conferences around the world to suggest that this model represents all of our communications with one another. And that's actually not what was intended. When Mehrabian developed the model, he was talking about communications where attitudes or feelings are being expressed. And then there were some other limitations that applied to the development of the model. I think it applies well to what we're talking about because we're certainly talking about attitudes or we're dealing with expressions of attitudes and feelings. And what I wanted to accomplish with this slide is to have us all bring to mind how much of the information we gather that comes from something other than the words that are spoken in the room. So we're gathering information, trying to make use of it to help parties reach resolutions. And we certainly get information from the things they say, but we also get information from other vocal cues. We get information from whether they're making eye contact with us, their facial expressions, their body language, their physical positioning, back from the table or close to the table, far away from the person to their right or close to the person to their right. And then there are many more examples that I'm sure we can all think of. Yes? Sure. Verbal communication, words. The 38 are sort of vocal cues that are not words, but some element that is being spoken. So, tone of voice, volume. I think vocal pauses could fit into that. Inflection. And then the 55% is the purely nonverbal stuff. So, you can think of lots of examples of body language that tell you something. I mean, the classic example is crossed arms, to be really sort of obvious about it, rolling eyes. But I think it can also be things like physical positioning in the room. And not only at the meeting, but when people are arriving at the meeting. I mean, I start picking up on these cues, the second I meet someone in the hallway, the second they're walking in the door.
I have a comment. So for me, 55% of the type of communication is taken out of the picture because I never see a person.
Right.
So that's how, so then I have to think about how is that limiting communication.
Right. So you're like 5 slides ahead.
Oh, sorry.
I promise. I mean, that is the essence of what I want to talk about, what I want us to talk about. And I'm going to kind of get to it piece by piece. So hold your horses and we'll get there. All right. Okay, so on top of that communication model, I'm going to add another one. Noam Ebner is a professor of negotiations and dispute resolution at Creighton University. And he developed a model that relates to negotiations and the use of technology. In developing this model, he decided that communication platforms, and again, these are technological platforms, could be divided into 2 categories. The first are media-rich platforms, and the second are media-lean platforms. So a media-rich platform is one that lets in more contextual cues rather than fewer contextual cues. So Jane, telephone might be a media-rich platform because you can hear tones of voice, you can hear vocal pauses, you can hear crying. As opposed to email, for example, where there are fewer of those cues coming in. So email communications and text communications might be put into the media lean platform category. It gets a little more complicated than that, but I think that's a good example to start with. Media-rich platforms allow for more interactivity in the communications. And what I mean by interactivity is this immediate exchange that happens when people are talking. So when we're having a conversation, I say something, Jane responds, I respond to her. Obviously, when you're communicating over email, there is some form of delay built into the communication, and that's what results in what I refer to as less interactivity. And because of these first 2 items, typically media-rich platforms tend to be more nuanced and allow for less ambiguity in communications, and obviously media-lean platforms then would be less nuanced. And potentially allow for greater ambiguity in the communications. So these media-rich and media-lean platforms also produce certain kind of social behaviors on our parts. So when dealing with a media-rich platform, parties tend to be more inhibited in their behaviors towards one another. And when they're dealing with a media-lean platform, they're less inhibited in their behaviors towards one another. And what I mean by inhibited is that they are more careful with one another, sort of more appropriate with one another when there are more cues for communication going through. And they're inclined to be a little less kind, less appropriate, less inhibited when we're dealing with a media-lean platform. And I think a lot of this stuff, hopefully, you will recognize that we all know intuitively. I mean, we've all experienced this stuff intuitively, and part of what I have been able to do from looking at this material is, giving names to ideas that I had already experienced. When a platform is media rich, there is a greater tendency, when a platform is media rich, there is a lower tendency for us to attribute negative motivations to the person that we're communicating with. And then the opposite is true with a media lean platform. There's much more space to fill in the gaps in information with some kind of negative assumption on the other party's part. And then party commitment, in terms of negotiation specifically, and mediation as well, I think party commitment, when you're dealing with a media-rich platform, is typically higher. Parties tend to get more invested in the process of negotiations or mediation, and when you're communicating with them through a media-lean platform, or at least when you're at that stage with them, there's less party commitment. It's easier for them to walk away. Gia?
She would like a recap of media rich and media lean.
Some brief examples.
Okay. So I'm just going to forecast that it gets a little muddy as we talk about this. There are other factors, but let's just take the 4 examples of telephone, email, texting, and video conferencing as the 4 forms of technology. So I think you would probably put video conferencing at the very top of the list as being a very media-rich platform, because you can see the person you're talking to, so you can witness the behaviors that they're engaged in. You can hear their tone of voice. You can see and hear that they're pausing. The opposite would be texting under this traditional construct, because texting obviously does not, it doesn't allow you to have a visual of the person. It doesn't allow you to hear tones of voice. It's limited. I'll get into other ways in which it's limited. Does that make sense? Okay. Yeah, I have issues with emojis. Personal issues, though. You don't have to have those. All right, we're gonna skip that one. So let's try this out just as an experiment with email. So in terms of media richness and media leanness, email, I don't know, maybe it's somewhere in between. There's no tone of voice, there's no visual context for the person you're talking to. There can be, and traditionally has been, fairly low interactivity, so you could go hours or days before receiving a response to an email message. Compared to face-to-face and phone interactions, it can be very difficult to interpret emotion, and it can be very easy to misread the cues that are coming with the message. So with email, parties are more likely, under this media-rich, media-lean construct, they're more likely to attribute negative things to each other, filling in gaps in information, and because of that, they're more likely to be adversarial with one another. So this is where it starts to get a little murky, I think, because the media leanness in email can be, I think it can be useful, depending on what is needed in the situation. So one thing that email does, because it's media lean, because we're not face-to-face, is it actually has a tendency to level the playing field a little bit. So studies have shown that when you have several people from an organization involved in a discussion, and the discussion is in person. The subordinate individuals in the organization are much less likely to participate in the conversation than their superiors are. But, and this is the study, when the communications are over email, it levels the playing field, and so people who are subordinates actually feel more comfortable making a contribution. So I could imagine if you were working with a district's team and there was an occasion for an email exchange, or you wanted to hear from someone in the organization that wasn't the principal or wasn't the special ed director, who you came to believe had a really good idea or actually had a great perspective on the case, that email might be a useful way to be able to draw that out. So that's taking advantage of media leanness. Email also is really good at sanitizing communications. When communications between parties, or even between a party and the mediator, have been very volatile, very emotional, email can be a way to get a message across, taking all of that out. I mean, there's a control issue here that doesn't always work, but it can be a method for accomplishing that. Email also, and these are sort of related, slows down communications and therefore is very content focused. So email can be useful when, and I've actually used it this way before, when I had an idea that I wanted to share with a party, or an offer that needed to be shared with a party that was maybe a little bit complex, and that I wanted the party to be able to really give some thought to really study. Email can be a very effective way to deliver that message because it allows, obviously, the recipient to digest it, to reread it, to sit on it, and to give it appropriate consideration, as opposed to a reaction in person that might be, that's just it's too much. It's too complicated. No. So for that reason, we really have to pay attention to content when we're dealing with email. Because of the absence of other contextual cues, the content in the message is very, very important. So let me talk about some considerations. And we can really, I'm going to put all of these up, and we can kind of do this however you all want. I mean, this is where I would really like for us to start having a discussion. These considerations, in addition to the considerations under the on the other hand category, are some ideas that I have about email, some experiences that I've had, and I'd really like you to stop me as I go along to add your own experiences. So one of the things you really have to do, and it's probably pretty obvious when you're dealing with email, is you have to guard clarity. Because the content is the focus when you're dealing with email messages, clarity is extremely important in messaging. One piece of advice that I've read in more than one place is that when you draft an email, you should reread your own email as if you're angry. You should try to feel angry and then reread your message. Because of the negative attribution tendency, it's likely that the recipient will read your email in that frame of mind. So you're better able to anticipate how they will receive the message if you've done a little rehearsal on your own. Watch for CC backfire. So I don't only mean here those disastrous incidents I've had, I don't know if any of you have, where you inadvertently CC someone. Not in a case. But I'm actually talking about, by CC backfire, what I'm referring to is situations where by emailing both parties in the same message, that has sometimes created a situation where it's an invitation for them to fight with one another over email. So you got to remember, you've got parties in conflict already. You've got the negative attribution tendency, and then they see the other party's name on the CC line or on the to line, and immediately that starts getting them fired up. So I don't know about you guys, and I'd be really interested in hearing what your experience is. I never, and this is true in almost all of the cases that I do, I really never email parties together. I mean, the only exception would be if I had two very experienced advocates who I thought, had made a deliberate assessment about and thought would not use my single email as an opportunity for taking little jabs at one another, then I might make an exception. But I really separate my electronic communications between the parties. So, yeah.
Are you concerned that my concern with doing it that way is a sense of impartiality, that I'm
Yep.
communicating separately with each party. And I have a hard time balancing that piece of it. And that's
Yeah.
why I tend to put parties, that's why I tend to put them on the same email to make sure that I'm being transparent with both sides.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's a really important consideration. One of the things that I always try to help parties understand in my very early interactions with them is that mediation is a process that can fairly involve, what I would refer to as ex parte communications. So communications with one party outside of the presence of the other party. And I don't necessarily do that in my opening email to them, say, by the way, I'm going to be emailing the other side. But I typically have a phone call pretty quickly with each of the parties. And in that telephone call, I make sure that I establish for them that just like I'm having an individual telephone call with you, I'm going to be having an individual telephone call with someone from the other side. So please understand that, my communications will happen that way, particularly prior to the mediation. And that's a useful way for me to communicate. It's not intended to, create the impression of some kind of impartiality. So I do think that that's a consideration with email, but what I have concluded, I guess, over the years is that that concern is outweighed by the number of times that I've seen parties get into, kind of spats with one another that really just aren't helpful and aren't necessary. And it can be almost anything. I mean, these emails that we send to parties prior to a mediation session are about, are we meeting at 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock? And that issue in and of itself can become a subject of contention between the parties. Well, if the district wants to meet at 10, and, the district is always trying to put things off, and look at this. This is just additional evidence of that kind of behavior. So, if I'm emailing them separately, and we're going back and forth about the times that we're going to start the meeting, I can sort of cleanse those communications by taking responsibility myself for the fact that we're meeting at 10, rather than having one party or the other have to sort of own that decision or that suggestion. So it's balancing, and maybe in some case you would decide that the impartiality concern outweighs this other concern that I'm highlighting, and then you would address that accordingly. Anyone else on emailing parties together? Jane?
Oh, not together.
Okay.
So not surprisingly probably to everyone. I get really long, rambling, emotional emails from parties. A lot of times it's from parents. So how do I respond to that? You may get them too and think, how do I respond to this? Do I read them? I, for the most part, skim them to see if there's any substantive information. Gives me information that, this party's highly emotional. And I always respond with short, direct email, because I'm trying to refocus them on how we're going to go forward, and this is what the next step is. So that's where I find email helpful, because when I get that same conversation on the phone, it's harder for me to refocus and redirect them. And it's helpful if I've had that email first and then we have the conversation. But I seem to get more and more really long emails from people, and I think it's a way of venting, which is good, but we have to think about an appropriate response that reflects our work, I think.
Yeah, and I would say in that instance that the length of your response is just as important as the content of your response. Because the length of your response sends the message, which is something like, this is not just quite the right time and place to talk about these issues. You know, these are relevant issues, but we can't deal with them here and now. And I think the one-sentence response period can be can be a powerful signal, almost regardless of what it says, actually.
And think about this, because we are going to talk about it. But it's going to be in a form, and it's going to be a focused conversation.
Right.
Which is, I think, comforting to some people, that there is going to be some structure to the process.
Any other thoughts?
I don't think it's microphone worthy, but I was listening to somebody who said not responding to an email or a text is as if you walked past someone and ignored them. So I do think you have to make some sort of a response.
Yeah, I agree with that. And this is, I mean, I'm going to say this now, but it's kind of built in a little bit later. I think it's really useful. The practice I've developed fairly recently is that if I know I can't get back to something quickly, I will typically send whoever it is a message saying, you know, I need 24 hours to give this some thought and I'll get back to you. Or I'm headed out of town, I'll get in touch with you on Friday. The other thing people seem to do a lot now is they kind of pair up pieces of technology. So you get an email from someone, you also communicate with that person via text, or you have their cell phone number, a quick text, got your message, you'll get a reply from me ASAP. Because those periods of time between the communications, extremely low interactivity, can be problematic. And that's the next one. So inconsistent expectations regarding promptness. When email was first a thing, there was this understanding that parties had to be at their desks to respond to email. But now we all carry our computers around in our pockets. So some parties or some people, individuals, have an expectation that you can respond to an email as quickly as you can a text message, and should. And then we'll start to make meaning of the fact that you didn't respond. I mean, I am I am really guilty of this. I actually send emails and I don't hear back, and I've had colleagues say to me, you make meaning out of, a delay in response, or what isn't even really a delay. Calm down. Just calm down about it. So I think we have to be careful about doing that ourselves. But I think your point, Kay, is that you have to be cognizant of the idea that the recipient or someone waiting for a reply is probably engaging in the same activity. And there are just very little quick things you can do to kind of cover yourself there. Jim.
Yeah, I think your idea of getting back to them right away and saying that you get no getting back, I think that's good, especially if you're trying to develop that trust.
Right. You're trying to build rapport. Yeah. So there is just generally a heightened expectation of immediacy in responses, that our communications, even electronic communications, are going to be highly interactive, even over email.
I think that it's a good point, though. So the younger the people are that I work with, the more they text instead of email. And I think there's a higher expectation to respond more quickly when it's a text than when it's email.
I think that's typically true, but I think that email and texting are coming a little closer to one another than they used to be, because, we all know that we have our email accounts with us now. So, it's subjective. And so one of the problems is it's very difficult to tell what the other person's thoughts are with regard to all that stuff. Here, Daryl, I'll give you the...
So I don't know whether this is a no-no or not, but again, this is coming from Daryl's world. So my cell phone is taboo. It's off limits. It's email or it's my home phone number. I don't do anything on my cell phone. That way I don't get any surprises. I'm not somewhere where I want to be, and then you're texting me on my cell phone and I can't respond appropriately. So it's just off limits.
And I think, As long as I would imagine that you communicate that with people fairly often.
Actually, I don't. It's just never been an issue. I just ensure.
You just don't give it out.
Yeah. And I
Okay.
ensure that when I respond, when I'm doing my pre-work, I'm on my home phone number. Call that number any time of the day, any time of the night. But the cell phone,
And I've even heard, exchanges where people have made meaning about whether someone will or won't give out a cell phone number. Is there an expectation that we share our cell phone numbers now? Or is it still, appropriate to say this is a number that is my private communication line, and this is the one that is my business communication line, and, I don't use the cell for business interactions?
I think the other thing that we, at least at Facets, are having a better self-awareness of is when we're sending emails. A lot of us take our work home with us and are working at very bizarre hours, potentially depending on the age of our children, and it's very easy to fire off emails to our colleagues or consumers at some very peculiar non-business hours, and that's because that's when we're comfortable working. But I think we've had some conversations about, one, what expectation does that set for people thinking that they then have to respond 24 hours a day at 3 in the morning? But two, it also, I was thinking about the whole conversation about barriers. It also kind of sends that message that I'm available to you whenever, 3 in the morning, midnight. So we've done a lot more with scheduling emails. If you write it at 3 in the morning, I'll schedule it to go out at 8 in the morning at a more typical time. And that's something that we've learned the hard way to do.
Yeah, no, that's a really good device, the scheduling of emails. I mean, I think the barrier point is a really important one. I started doing it so people wouldn't think I was weird, because I tend to do a lot of work late at night. And, I actually had people say to me, I think it's really bizarre when I receive an email from someone at 1 o'clock in the morning. And actually, your point, Courtney, gets to this avoid distracted reading and distracted drafting. So we try to be responsive in our business communications to show people that we're committed to our work, we're available. That can actually create problems. We are so eager to do a good job by responding quickly that we can make big mistakes in drafting. And so even though I'm sitting on the train, from Chicago to the Milwaukee airport and have a little time to shoot off a couple emails, I think it's important for me to ask myself whether I really should be doing that after I just heard a case, for the last 7 hours. It's not always a good idea, and sometimes the need for clarity outweighs the need for immediacy. Did you have something, Daryl?
yeah, I was just going to say that it took me a while to figure out that, when it comes to parents, especially, some parents work second shift, some parents work third shift. So, I mean, I've had many instances where I've gotten emails, at like 3 o'clock in the morning, and I'm like, what the hell? But, I figured it out, right? And then I've had emails like, from parents that were just like, they were biting, they were like intrusive. And so I couldn't even imagine getting like a text like that on my cell phone. That would just like be not good. So, boundaries.
Yeah. Texting is really interesting, and we're going to get into it a little bit more.
So I was just going to add this is maybe somewhat self-evident, but I think that the purpose of your communication is important too, because especially, I know this is true for me, and I think my sense is it gets more true for people the younger and younger they are. But if my phone rings, I kind of think it's an emergency. Whereas, if someone just wants to schedule something or, confirm a time or whatever, if my phone rings, it distracts me. I'm usually in the middle of something. I think it's important. I pick it up. And I really would prefer an email for a lot of that stuff. So I think just thinking about, why you're communicating with someone and what their preference may be. It's hard to predict, but phone calls, I think used to be viewed as much more personal, and now they're becoming viewed, at least by some people, probably me included, as more interrupting in some sense, unless it's urgent.
Yeah, and the phone, feel free to bring up the phone examples. I don't have a slide on phones, but it kind of gets mixed in with all of these discussions. My children don't use the telephone. I mean, the only time they use the telephone is when I remind them that it is an available device and they might want to consider it as a form of communication and that it is appropriate sometimes. At the same time, I cannot remember the last time I picked up a call where I didn't recognize the phone number. I just don't. I think that's a generational thing because my parents still answer the phone whenever it rings, which I think is kind of crazy. So, yeah, the phone is also complicated. Okay. Watch for cherry picking. Email really lends itself to being able to avoid issues that you do not want to address. And so when that happens, obviously we have to figure out what to do. I think the first question in that decision-making tree is, do I really believe this was deliberate or was it not deliberate? Going back to distracted reading and distracted drafting, sometimes people just miss things. And I think we have to be very careful to not make meaning out of that fact and to really determine that the failure to respond to a question or to provide information that was requested was actually a decision, a deliberate decision, or was it just an editing error?
I have found that especially, well, maybe it's not especially with younger people, but if it depends on how you write the email. If it's bullet pointed, I usually get responses to most of the questions. If they're not bullet pointed, but they're in a dialogue form, half of them get missed. And so I've learned that to really, yeah, and really pick up on that with how people communicate back to me.
Okay, unmask yourself. This is one that is a challenge for me, but an email can come across as being much more personal and much more, therefore, effective if you are able to insert details that kind of locate you in space and time, because they make you a person rather than just a sender. So a good example would be referring to the fact that it was snowing this morning, and the roads were really tough. Or how's the weather in Milwaukee? It's beautiful here in Madison. Or you can think of lots and lots of examples that pertain to you, but just a simple reference to geography or some phenomenon that makes you a real person in a real place can accomplish actually quite a lot in making a communication like email more contextual, more personal. I mean, I really struggle with that. I tend to be fairly businesslike in my messages. I get right to the point, I get done, I only say thank you once, and then I write my name. And so, it's something that I have to be very deliberate about, and I have to do it sometimes even when I don't really feel that comfortable with it. So that can be helpful. Anyone have any tips for how to do that? That's good, that's good.
So I thought I would emphasize something for someone, and I wrote it in all caps, and the person responded and said, "Stop yelling at me." I was like, oh my gosh, I never thought about that. Really? So that's such a subjective interpretation, and then I, apologized and said that's not what I meant. I just wanted to point out this piece of information, but, so don't use all caps.
Yeah, I've actually come in my writing, whether it's over email or some other form, I have stopped using caps, I've stopped italicizing, and I've stopped underlining. And part of the reason I don't do that is because at some point I developed this notion that the recipient would think that I was suggesting that they couldn't read carefully, that they weren't paying attention, and they needed me to draw, a red arrow towards that before a break. Oh, okay. A red arrow towards the point I was trying to get across. So I actually really have scaled back on a lot of that stuff because I think people make meaning of it, and I have decided that You know, what I need to do is trust people to read my communication and then do something about it if I figure out that they haven't. We'll just do these last two, which should take a couple minutes. Consider non-chronological receipt. So you send an email, and before you get a reply, you send another one because you need to make a point of clarification. Some people will read their email messages from the top of the inbox down, which means they're reading your communication in reverse chronological order, which can be really problematic, depending on the content of the second message and the content of the first message. You know, one way to deal with that, and I've done this, might be to shoot a text and say, just sent you a couple emails, please read the 1 o'clock message first. You know, or even leave a voicemail accomplishing that same thing. But your communications can be read out of order, and that can have an impact on their substance and their impact.
Is it appropriate to use, like sometimes I'll put in the subject line PS, PSS,
I do that.
so that's something you can do.
Yeah, I do that, or read this one. Right, right. And then I already talked about pairing with a text or a telephone call. Honestly, I really think people do this more and more often. I think they pair up their communications, which, is that a scowl? Does it just create, yeah, because in some sense it just creates more static, right? Depending on how many voicemails. Yeah, yeah. Right. So I think, you know, I think we have to be careful about deciding to do that. I mean, I could only really see doing it in kind of an urgent situation where I really needed someone to know, or I knew that a person wasn't likely to check their email, which is more and more common, and then I needed to alert them that there was actually a message in the inbox that I really needed them to look at because it was longer and I needed to send it over email. Carolyn.
I have learned to be careful about mixing my texts and my email messages because I like to have my email messages be a documentation of the communication. And when I text something, that information is not included in the record. And I haven't learned how to overcome that gap. Perhaps you have one.
I do. Well, you can take a screenshot and you can email it to yourself. And then you save the communication. So if you have an iPhone, it's just the power button on the top and the power button in the middle, and you press them at the same time, and it takes a photograph of your screen. Oh, I only have an 8. That's my best advice. But on all phones, you can take a screenshot of some kind. It's not the most convenient way. I mean, I agree with you. It's more difficult to have, you know, it's difficult to create a file with text messages. So are we taking like a 15-minute break? All right, we'll go to text messaging after that. Okay. So let's go on to texting, and I'm going to approach this in just a little bit of a different way because I have a kind of bigger consideration that I want to talk about. All right, so with texting, in terms of media richness and media leanness, I think at first glance, we would probably all agree that of the platforms I've identified, that it is the most media lean platform. It obviously doesn't have images, it doesn't have voices, you can't underline, you can't bold. Jane, you can still do all caps in text if you want to. You can use emoticons, but for a person who's always been a little uncomfortable even with the exclamation mark, I'm not going to go there. And you know, there's actually a question, and it'll be interesting to see how this evolves, as to whether emoticons will ever have a serious role in serious business communications, but they are becoming very common now. Anyway, so there are fewer linguistic cues that indicate emotion, and text messages are always fairly brief. I mean, I think if people want to write a longer message, they tend to go to email. So it's fairly media lean. So let's just step back from that for a minute and talk about our view of these things. I think we all assume, right? That texting is the most media lean. We get to email, it's a little more. Telephone is better. And then I guess I forgot video conferencing, which would be right up there. So we assume that if a platform is media rich, that it's preferable because it lets in more cues for communication. But there's another factor that actually relates to familiarity, generally, that I want to introduce into our understanding of all of this. So data usage indicates that texting has been the primary mode of communication now for over a decade. And the amount that we text is still directly inverse to our age. So younger generations use texting more. They use texting to maintain family relationships, to maintain friendships, to build friendships, to maintain even romantic relationships. There's a word for that, intimacy over texting. They use their phones to check text messages when they wake up and before they go to sleep. And there's actually some information that indicates that certain people experience a great deal of anxiety when they don't have access to text messages. So as I was saying earlier, my children don't use the telephone. They would never email. They rely on text messaging exclusively for their communications, unless they're forced to do something else. But my children are still teenagers, so they're a little young for our purposes. Let's take someone who is a parent in a case that we have, who has a first grader or maybe a second grader. That person might be 28, 29 years old. That person was born in 1990. In the first decade of his or her life, the use of the cell phone and texting was becoming a thing. And in the second decade of that person's life, texting as a form of communication was becoming absolutely ubiquitous. So that individual is going to have the experience of having communicated via text message for almost their entire lives as being the primary mode of communication. I'm going to skip to down here. A person who is most familiar and most comfortable with text messaging as a platform for communicating will tend to perceive that platform as being media rich. Not under the criteria that I was evaluating before only, but with that familiarity piece added into it. So we have to have a different perception. We have to understand that those individuals, depending on their age and their experience, are going to have a much different perception about whether a platform is media rich or media lean that has nothing to do with whether you can see someone's face or whether you can hear their voice or whether you can send a very long message. By the way, people tend to prefer, people that are comfortable with texting tend to prefer messages, written messages that are linguistically simpler. If they're shorter, if they're more casual, if they have no punctuation, studies have shown that these features create the impression of a message that is more authentic and more personal. A message without commas and periods, which I can't even imagine writing, makes me feel a little squeamish just to think about it, is something that would be perceived as being more genuine than my message where every prepositional phrase is set off with commas.
So I kind of want to check and see if I'm understanding that last bullet. When a platform is perceived as media rich, it will be used that way. So if someone perceives text messaging as media rich, which it isn't.
But it is.
But, so they'll use it that way, but it's not It's not legitimate.
It
It
doesn't
does.
let in the cues.
Right.
But there's a perception of it conveying a type of message that is very personal and very authentic and genuine. It's short, it's to the point, it's not bogged down by grammar and punctuation. And younger, so the studies that I was looking at have shown that younger people tend to perceive that kind of message, again, as being more authentic, as somehow letting, and I know it's contradictory, but letting in more cues. So the point is that this media-rich, media-lean platform construct doesn't get to the whole issue.
So I just want to speak a little bit as the other perspective. And I was thinking, as I was actually literally just texting my babysitter about what she should feed the children tonight, that I don't find text to be very media, the opposite of media rich, whatever that was, media poor. I don't, I think because of how they're used and because of emojis and because of the immediacy of it, it's actually, yeah, I would definitely not consider, I find it more media rich actually than some other communications.
That's the perspective. And think about it, again, with a generation, I'm not talking about you right now, Christina, but a generation that conducts, right. So a generation that has conducted like intimate relationships via text messaging clearly sees it as a viable platform for very close communications, despite the fact that all of these cues are missing. And it also has the immediacy, so it can be a little more like a conversation because it has the immediacy that email doesn't have. So we'll get to that. Let me show, I'll come back over to this table.
People who are not highly educated or like to write find it a very fulfilling form of communication. I think, would prefer to use it and do see it as media rich.
Yep.
You have to, I think about the person that's using it too.
Yeah, and that's really the essence of the point. What is that individual most comfortable with? And that's going to be a very subjective position. And it could be counterintuitive to what we believe should be true because of what we understand about how we want to be able to make eye contact and we want to hear the tone of voice. So this is a screen that I showed you earlier about what I think we traditionally tend to assume. But people who are of a younger generation who see more in texting, who see a greater ability to communicate effectively and genuinely through texting, are going to look at it like this. And it's significant because in my simple little diagram there, it should demonstrate that it is exactly the opposite of what we would assume is true. So,
I was just wondering if there's been any studies that have taken a look at this from a urban-rural perspective.
that's a good, I don't know the answer, but I think it's a good question. I mean, I think there's a lot to be done with this. So if there isn't already, I would imagine it's coming. So I had a case recently, I'll just get into a hypothetical and then I'll take more questions. I had a case recently where on the parent side, I was dealing with a single mom. And I started the way I usually start. I sent her an email and said, we need to set up a day for a meeting. I'd like to have a telephone conversation with you. And I couldn't get her to answer my email messages at all. Until finally, I actually talked to Jane a little bit about it and finally wrote to her and said, if we can't communicate about this and if we can't arrange these logistics, we're not going to be able to have a mediation session. Obviously, we've got to get this set up. I also, with the same parent, arranged for this telephone call, and the phone call went equally poorly. She did not want to talk on the phone with me. She even though she had chosen the time for the call, she then suggested that she had to be somewhere like right away. She didn't want to answer what I thought were fairly straightforward questions, like, are you going to have a representative with you, and, you know, what time works for you? I mean, it was not comfortable for her, and it was not a successful phone call. It was not a positive exchange. And I finally figured out with her that I should be using her cell phone number. And I said to her, can I just text you? You know, would that be an easier way for us to communicate? And she said, sure. And she gave me her cell phone number. It was like night and day. She responded to me immediately. She was answering substantive questions that she had not been willing to answer over the telephone even. And then we got to the mediation session, and we were working on a communication system between the district and her, related to the, you know, the substance of the case. And as she was talking about what would work for her for a communication system, she said, mostly to the district, that's who she was trying to work it out with, you know, I just can't deal with emails. I mean, I get so many emails, and every single one of them feels like a burden to me. I don't have time for that. I don't like email. I don't want to do it. And, you know, of course, these bells are going off for me all along in our communication. And she was fairly young. She was in that age demographic that I mentioned. And this single platform for communication was most comfortable for her. I, on the other hand, remember the first time that I received a text message from a party. It was actually in an arbitration case rather than a mediation, but I don't think that matters. We had a hearing set up for, it was sometime in January. The weather was supposed to be horrible on the day of the hearing. We all had to travel to the site of the hearing. And I had sent an email to the parties and said, here's my cell phone number. If you have any problems on your way, please feel free to get in touch with me, and, you know, we'll discuss it. The next morning, I got a text message from one of the parties. That was not what I was expecting at all. I mean, I thought he would call me. And I looked at it, and I had like a mini heart attack, because I thought, as a neutral, oh, this is not appropriate. You know, because my experience with text messaging had been as a platform that I used to communicate with my husband, my children, and my friends. You know, maybe about like, what time are we going to meet for drinks? And it just occurred to me as crossing some kind of line that was really not appropriate. And then I stood back for a minute and I thought, you know, I did give him my cell phone number, and texting is a thing. And I certainly didn't say, don't text me. So, and he's younger than me by probably 10 years, I would say. And I think it just seemed completely appropriate and normal to him. So, you know, we just have to really stand back and be careful about how subjective that platform can be. So I overlooked a couple comments.
I was just going to echo what's on this slide and what Christine was saying, because I think I have 2 teenage boys, and they absolutely think they can convey everything they need to convey by text. And it's actually true, because if you get them on the telephone, I mean, first, you're lucky. Yes, you're lucky if they answer. They like grunt and, you know, I mean, I had to, yes. Yes, I had to say things like, say goodbye before you hang up. Like, I'm trying to I mean, they have no idea how to use the telephone. And so certainly we get more insight to them through texting than the telephone.
Right. And this is not, you know, just to make sure it's not a gender thing, my 17-year-old daughter, who is going to be a very successful adult someday, cannot talk on the phone. So we're trying to figure that out. I mean, we're trying to work on that a little bit. But it's not just little boys.
Well, and we are talking about a lot of generalities and stereotypes with generations and stuff like that. And I think for the most part it's true. But I think we need to be cognizant of people individually. Because I have a 24-year-old son who will sooner pick up the phone and call me than he will text me. And my father will sooner text me than call me. So, you know, you just never know.
Yeah. And that's where I think in every case with every party, it's important to be kind of running this constant assessment about what's working, what isn't working, and even asking the question specifically, would this work, would texting work better for you, or you don't seem to use email much, so we just talk on the phone?
So I have kind of the tween age kids, so what's coming down the pike, my kids only use texting for like mom or dad, grandma and grandpa. They don't use it to socially communicate at all anymore. They do everything in Snapchat and Instagram, and these are all apps that they use, and it's almost hard to get my son who's 13 to return a text because he doesn't text. And so these folks are going to be parents someday entering these systems. And I think I've kind of tried to figure out why. And a lot of those apps so they cut down on the words. So my daughter will post a picture of the basketball tournament she's at with a word that says Sunday. And that's supposed to convey to everyone, here's what I'm doing on Sunday, I'm spending my time. They add a layer of media in that a text doesn't always have. They can do recordings of stuff. And so I think those apps are more attractive to kids than just a straight text. But I think we're going to reach a place where, my kids already tell me, oh, text is so yesterday, Mom. So.
Right. So we're talking about texting as kind of the thing now, and it's quickly, I'm probably going to pass us by. And email is so long ago. Okay. So a little more on texting, and this gets to the point about not making generalizations, assuming that we understand because of someone's generation or their gender or any other factor what they're going to prefer. We have to anticipate that these are very subjective perceptions, and that the best way to understand what the perception is to try to get to it somehow with the individual you want to communicate with. It's really important to, especially with texting where messages are brief, to guard yourself against inferring more than was intended by the message, and that may take some effort at clarifying. Watching spell check, you've probably heard this, we've all had experiences with it. I just heard a story about it's prom season right now, and apparently some phone system takes the word corsage and turns it into croissant. And so these kids were texting one another, what kind of corsage would you like for the prom? And it was coming out, what kind of croissant would you like for the prom? And so somebody, made something of this, and apparently there's a bakery that is now producing croissant corsages. And this is a thing. So, they'll wear it on their little croissant on their wrist, or maybe, it could look nice, that kind of half moon shape. But really, you really do have to watch for spell check, because of course not only does the system change the word, but it changes the word to the last thing you would ever want to type to someone. And so again, and there's a tension here. It's not that I, think you all aren't careful. I'm sure you are, but when you're texting, you're trying to be quick, and you're often doing it on the fly. And so there is a temptation to type it and send it, and we really have to slow ourselves down. All of these tools make us faster and more efficient, and maybe the thing we should be doing is working against that a little bit.
Well, I can't type with my thumbs like the kids do and get it fast, so I usually talk my texts. And then I do Airbnb, and these people were coming for my Airbnb, and so I said, lots of luck on your trip, and it changed the word luck, and I didn't catch it. And afterwards, I read it, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I did that. But, so, read them over before you send them.
I did that too. Fortunately, it was a friend on the other end.
How thoughtful of you. At least it wasn't at church or something. All right. So the other piece is watched interactivity. Again, this goes back to the point that people have expectations about how quickly you're going to respond. Typically, the expectation has been that responses to text messages are much faster than responses to email messages, and when you let it sit, it can create a problem. So even the, I'll get back to you, or in a meeting, call you later, or whatever it needs to be. And now there are those like autofill, so it's much easier. I'm convinced that my youngest child only communicates with me now using autofills. So watch the interactivity. And speaking of that child, this can be the result if you don't respond right away. So this is a screenshot of my phone after I didn't respond for 9 minutes to my son's inquiry as to whether I could pick him up. And then, strangely, I noticed I did the same thing. So, sorry, catch bus. Are you guys on the bus? I mean, I can't wait for, his response either. So I'm guilty of the same thing.
Can I ask a question about cell phones in mediation?
Oh, yeah, that's a good one.
So I think that we, for a long time, thought, put your phones away, put your computers away. And I think that may change. Like, we did a role play at one of the trainings, and Courtney was playing the parent, and she was like, I'm not putting my cell phone away because I have a sick child at home, and I'm waiting for information, and it's going to cause me too much anxiety. So I'd like to hear if any of you have had any recent experiences with technology in the mediation session that would be helpful.
Well, I just ask about it, and that way they can explain there's a sick child. With the school, a lot of times the computer is viewed as a barrier. It's not very friendly, and then the school will say, this way we can bring up what the schedule is, or we can bring up what the IEP said. So once they explain how they're going to use it, that's worked out just fine.
Thank you.
This has occurred in special education mediation, but it's also occurred in other types of mediation cases where somebody is recording the mediation, either with their phone or by typing on their computer. I've had both, where I've had to interrupt that behavior, and that's not always a popular thing to have to do. And so I am wondering about what you all do with computerized note-taking. Some of us can type verbatim what people say. I can't.
Were you raising your pen?
I had a situation where, unbeknownst to me and anyone else, the parent was recording the session. And then after the agreement went out, this woman said, well, this isn't what you said. It wasn't referring to me, but something to the effect that this wasn't what was said within the mediation. And that absolutely put hackles on my back. And I sent an email and said, you didn't have permission from the district or from me. It was totally inappropriate for you to be recording this session without letting people know that you were going to record the session. The thing was falling apart anyway, so it really didn't matter. But I mean, I think that's, I don't caution people about that, but even after that incident, but I mean, obviously you can't have that happening in the mediation session where people are recording and then depending on what they use it later against one of the other parties saying, well, this isn't what you said, or, I mean, that comes up all the time and referring to what was said in IEP meetings, but not, at least I've never had it other than that one case where they said they actually had had recorded what was said.
Happens more than we know. Yeah, and it's I'm sorry, Jane. It's well, it's possible that when you see
That I'm sending out now between the time you're assigned a case and the time they meet. Now, I can't remember that that's on there, but I'll check and maybe add that.
And it's possible that the presence of some of these devices, whether it's a cell phone, because you can record a meeting with a cell phone or a laptop, whether the presence of these devices creates a need for additional ground rules or an emphasis of ground rules, an emphasis of the confidentiality provision in the mediation agreement. Jim?
So what if in your ground rules, you said no recording, and they said, one of the parties said, well, I want to record this?
That's in the,
Well, by statute, you can't
yeah.
mediation, but then a number of years ago, I realized we can't tell someone who has a disability need that they can't record it. So if someone will give me a note from a doctor saying this is why they have to record it, it's never happened, because when I've asked for that, it's never materialized, but that would be the only reason. IEP meetings can be recorded if both parties agree.
Right.
But mediations cannot, unless there's that disability.
So in those situations, you advise the parties not to record, assuming that was legitimate reason that they provided the transcript of that recording or copy of the recording.
It has never happened,
Your knowledge.
to my knowledge. Right, if it was, I would have to think that through, because I haven't had to. But that would probably be a good idea.
Yeah, because then the other side knows what's in the recording, and they're citing something that they believe is said, and they said, they can be sure that they're accurately, presenting what was really said.
I mean, the statute does say you can't record it.
Right.
And I've just been waiting for the challenge, but I haven't had it yet.
So they all say, I'm sure I said this in the meeting, or I'm sure I said that, but in fact, maybe this,
Well, that's why they want to, or they're used
what
to.
you wanted to say, but you never said it.
Or they're used to recording the IEP meeting, so they want to record the mediation.
But it's manipulated recording.
And could it be used in a due process hearing?
It's the content of the mediation.
Going a step further, no, because what is ever said or offered in mediation can't be. But somebody could argue, well, I did this because I have a disability, so, they could try to get the judge to accept it, but I don't know that they would uphold that. You think the judge is that informed about mediation? I think our administrative law judges are, yeah.
The mediation agreement includes a statement that says, further, we agree there shall be no stenography or other record made of the mediation. Maybe that simply has to be expressed.
But if somebody comes to me and says, I've had this happen, I have a disability, so are you denying me access because I have a disability?
And maybe part of what you could address there is that the purpose of the recording is to allow that individual and only that individual to, be able to fully participate in the process and not circulate it and not use it as evidence in a subsequent proceeding and not, share it with the other party. So,
If we were to stress this part of the agreement, we would avoid the cases that you had, where a parent is only communicating with
yeah. I mean, I go over the agreement and I certainly emphasize that part of it, but I'm not sure that it would always, in every case, act as a true barrier to someone deciding that they're going to do it anyway. Thinking, well, it's my phone, I'm going to use it the way I want to. Let me just, getting away from the recording piece of it and the kind of confidentiality piece a little bit, I have really mixed feelings about like the use of laptops, for example, in mediation sessions or cell phones. I haven't worn a watch for years, and I started wearing a watch because I started feeling really self-conscious about looking at my phone to figure out the time during a mediation session. Because I thought, well, maybe the parties think I'm going to check my email, and that's rude and inappropriate. I use, I teach law, I teach arbitration and mediation at UW Law School. My law students only use laptops in the classroom. Every class session, from beginning to end, they have their laptops open. I never see them carrying a piece of paper or anything like that. And so, the presence, again, this goes back to familiarity and our subjective perceptions of what is appropriate and what isn't. I think it doesn't feel strange to them at all to be seeing me over the top of their open laptop. When I'm asked to draft mediation agreements at sessions, In special ed cases, I bring my laptop and, I tend to type it out as we're going along. I tend to be working on the provisions, but I'm also really aware of the fact that I feel like it gets in the way sometimes. So, I occasionally will just put my laptop off to the corner of the table, because I really don't always want to be talking to someone through or over the use of that device. No, I don't, but I read it and over again. I read each provision as it's being drafted. If a single word changes, I go back and I read it again, and then in the end, I read it again. So, no, I could not handle a projector. Okay, let's talk about video conferencing, because I think it's an interesting area. So, as we talked about with richness and leanness, video conferencing seems to be at the top of the list. It allows for maximum channels for cues. There's obviously high interactivity, lots of nuance. Just gets a high score across the board for being able to pass contextual cues for communication. On the other hand, and this is a big one because it's a mistake that is often made, it is not in person. And I think people often feel like video conferencing is just as good as being there, and there are things to be cautious about in that arena. Okay, so even when you're operating over video, you have to figure out a way that feels comfortable to you to underscore or sort of exaggerate, demonstrate your behaviors that you would use to create rapport. And I think it's probably true with actors as well. When they're being filmed, they tend to act a little more than you would, use your arms a little more than you would if you were just talking with someone in person. And to get your nonverbal messages across on video, they do have to be a little bit exaggerated, or they're not going to come across as effectively. Addressing the skills issues. So this goes back to the beginning of the presentation when I totally couldn't make the thing work. If you agree to do a mediation that involves video conferencing, and you get to the mediation and it doesn't work, that can really undermine the mediator's credibility right from the very beginning. So anytime technology is introduced, and I'm sort of a Luddite too. I'm not doing this presentation because I'm really savvy with technology. So if it ever comes into play, I take whatever steps I need to take to make sure that it is going to work. And that doesn't always mean that I make sure that I'm going to make it work. It sometimes means that I make sure that I have someone there who knows how it's going to work. Because if you're relying on it and it can't work, it can be very disappointing for the parties. Imagine a situation where you are going to have someone participate in a mediation via video conferencing and it's not working, and suddenly they're just over the telephone, which doesn't feel nearly as adequate or as satisfying. The participation is not as complete. So make sure you know what you're doing in advance. And then there's a question about establishing additional ground rules. We talked about some of them related to recording and privacy. You might need to make parties aware of the fact that it's your expectation that it is only the people you can see on the screen in the room. And if someone else comes into the room, that everyone needs to know about that, or we need to take a break. Doors can open pretty quietly and people can be walking around in the background, and I think it's likely that the other side could feel fairly sort of blindsided by the presence of someone who wasn't really supposed to be a part of the conversation, even if they're just coming in to grab, whatever, this pair of scissors. So it's worth talking about all of the expectations in addition to recording and privacy considerations. Control the environment. This is a little bit related. When you are appearing by video conferencing, obviously whoever is on the other end can only see what is within your frame. If parties figure out that there's something going on in the background, so if you're in your office and your administrative assistant walks in and is doing something in the background and they can see the elbow, even though that's completely inappropriate or completely appropriate and nothing was intended by it, it can again, undermine their confidence in what is going on. There's some activity in the background that they weren't aware of. So you have to really maintain strict control of your environment. Unequal participation. I think this is probably the most problematic scenario. I've had this before where I had one party in person and one party participating in a mediation by video conferencing. And it was sort of an interesting case because the reason the party was, it was an employment case, the reason the party was participating only by video conferencing was because of the disability that was actually at the heart of the discrimination claim. So that, was sort of complicated to try to work through. But I was nervous about that case. It seemed necessary, and occurred to me that there was really no way around it. So I had fairly lengthy conversations with the parties and left it at, well, let's try it. It seems to be the thing to do. But I had to work much harder to, again, create a rapport with the party that was participating by video conferencing than I did with the party that was participating in person.
Just a quick question.
Yeah.
When you're doing video conferencing, how did you handle a caucus situation?
So I've heard different, actually in this particular case, it worked out really well because it was all separate caucuses. I think when we were, it wasn't all separate because I always start with a joint session. When we were doing the joint session, it was in a separate room and the individual appeared by telephone in that room. And then when we went into the separate caucuses, that's when the video conferencing took place. I've heard other neutrals talk about this and how that can be a really frustrating and just kind of, it can be a hassle. Someone was telling me that the parties were on the other end, the neutral was in Illinois, and he just came up with arrangements with the parties about, okay, well, when we need to caucus, you're going to leave, and then you're going to come back in, and then you're going to leave, and we're going to all make sure that we're really upfront about the door being closed and everybody's out. I think it depends on the facility you're in, really, and what kind of technology is available. The worst case scenario in my mind is one that someone suggested to me and I resisted, which was that one party would appear by video conference, but I would be in Madison with the other party and we would all be at this table together, which meant that to get us all on screen, I was going to have to sit on the same side of the table with that party that was present. Can you imagine walking into a mediation and saying, I'm going to sit on, the district side today. I'm going to sit on the parents' side. And I said to them, it's not going to work. I won't do it. It creates a horrible perception, even if they know that we're just doing this because, they can't travel to Madison and we're trying to figure out a solution. There has to be something else. So then we actually separated we were in separate rooms. I was in one room, same building, one party was in the other room, and then a party was in Chicago. And I do this, Nissan was asking me what video platform I find to be most useful. I do these arbitration scrimmages with the law school where my students scrimmage against students in New York at Cornell. And we may have the neutral in Madison, even at the law school. We put the neutral in a separate room. My students are in one room. Other students are in New York, and they always use Zoom. The law schools have found that Skype is yesterday, Zoom is the thing. I'm sure there are other platforms, but Zoom seems to be the one that works, and we've done it a few times, and it goes off without a hitch, knock on wood. The other thing that I really am not crazy about with things like video conferencing is this idea that I think of as being shared conditions. So I think really one of the wonderful things that happens when we mediate is that we create this kind of miniature environment. We're all there, we're all trying to get something done. If the room is too hot, it's too hot for everyone. If it's been a long time since we had something to eat because there isn't a restaurant close by, everyone's hungry. Or if there's a snowstorm that's building and the snow's going to start to fall at 4 o'clock, we all feel this momentum for getting this thing done because of the conditions that we're going to encounter when we leave. And I think that works sort of miraculously to do something that is a little bit difficult to describe, but I think it's an element. And when you're in separate locations, you just don't have that. You can't create that environment. You can't experience those shared conditions. It's important to be aware of the last two things, which are kind of logistics. Eye contact is different. So when you are appearing by video conference, you're looking at the center of your screen because that's where the people are. Your camera is at the top of your screen. So it will always appear like you're not really exactly making eye contact, and vice versa. Same with, the people you're looking at. And people, neutrals, I think, they read something from that? Why are they not making eye contact with me? Why are they always looking up or looking down? I understand that technology is going to be fixed where the camera will be right in the center of the screen, but maybe, I don't know, people smarter than me would have to do that. But it's a concern, it creates this oddity in the communication. The other thing is that you have to make sure that your camera angle and screen size are appropriate. So screen size is, how much you're taking into the screen. Is it just you? Is it more of your environment? Is it just your face? Is it you sort of, down to your torso? I mean, you should be making decisions about that depending on how you want to come across. And the same with camera angle. If you watch movies, you'll notice that some scenes are shot with the camera below the character, looking up at the character. And that's intended to make the character seem intimidating, sort of larger than life. If a director wants to make a character seem small or insignificant, the camera is tilted down at that person. If you want the character to seem very approachable, the camera is right at eye level. And so you can do that same thing with your camera angle and create an impression. If you want to be really dominating, put your camera up high and make sure your camera is sort of coming up at you so you look bigger and taller. Maybe the best approach, in the kinds of conversations we have is this eye level approach. But that requires some experimentation and some know-how in terms of how to set things up.
Just a question, what do you do to prepare for the technology not working? Let's say you agreed to do it, the parent has requested it.
Mm-hmm.
You got it all set up, and then all of a sudden,
Yeah. Then what? I mean, my basic approach is just to make sure that there are people who know what to do. So, right, exactly. I mean, typically, we're going to a school district building, but I will be very careful about having a conversation about, who's going to be there when we're ready to get started. What if we go after hours? What if we go until 7:30, 8 o'clock at night? Is there going to be someone there still who will know how to operate the system after everyone else has gone home? So I just try to be very careful about making sure that someone knows what they're doing. Short of that, I think you really just have to experiment with the system. And then I guess I should say the other thing I do is just try to be really transparent with the parties about what it means to introduce that form of technology into the conversation, including the idea that it may not work. And that we may have to have some kind of backup if it doesn't work. It wouldn't be preferable, but at least we know we can continue. I try to anticipate it. I try to be very explicit about how we're going to, deal with all of this, how it seems worth it because of other considerations. Yeah, that's the most, I think, the easiest. And everyone has a phone. So, final thoughts. I put down shed resistance, but I thought about putting down get over it. meaning I think we all really have to work on coming around to the idea that this is obviously the way things are going. I was going to tell a little story for video conferencing. So some of the labor arbitration work I do is in the railroad industry, which is the oldest, most traditional industry out there. And I have been very surprised to learn from those parties that some of them are actually conducting almost all of their arbitration work via video conferencing. So that's ironic. I mean, that's not at all what I would have expected. I thought they would be the holdouts. But they've recognized the efficiency and, you know, the other attractive features of being able to do that. So I think we just all have to make sure that we are moving forward with the technology. Think about the defaults relates to one's own defaults and others' defaults, others' S' defaults. So what is your default when it comes to communicating? Do you go to email because email is what you've always used? Do you now prefer video conferencing? Do you tend to, you know, text because that's what you do with everyone else in your life anyway? And then like I had to do with that party that the mother that I was describing to you, you know, it took me a little while, but I had to come around to understanding what her default was. Her default was texting, and that was for a reason. It was clearly a more comfortable, more effective way for her to communicate. So ask yourself if your default is evolving, or if it's stagnant. Yeah.
You know, I need to talk to you about this request I got from the district, or would you prefer email? So I've sort of started having to explore communication at that level.
Right.
The calling can be awkward now.
Yep.
I had a parent that I called like 3 times and didn't get a call back from them, and finally I got a call back, and I had left a message, but no, I couldn't leave a message because they didn't have a mailbox. So he called back and said, "Who is this that's calling me?" And so I told him, he says, "Oh, well, good, I thought you were a collection agency."
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Well, that goes to the, you know, I don't answer numbers that I don't know. I mean, if somebody leaves a voicemail, then I'll call them back if I know them, but it's just not the way people operate.
It used to be that our cell phones were exempt from all those calls, but they're not anymore.
Right.
We were talking too about email, not too many, but there are some parents that don't have email.
Right.
And if they do, they go to the library once a week.
Right. So that's really burdensome. Right. I mean, the last thing as a parent you want to do is another errand. Yeah.
Yeah, I get a lot of requests for mediation now, where they take a picture of their phone and then text it to me. Wait, what? I get requests for mediation by phone. So they text the form. They fill out the form, take a picture of it, and text it to me. Oh, interesting. Or sometimes email it.
So I think these are people that are operating solely with the use of a phone, don't have a laptop or a desktop, don't use a laptop or a desktop at home, at least.
I think one thing that we need to be aware of, though, is some of these apps, the information that we put on these apps it's not ours, and it's not private. And so I use my email with I won't give legal advice over text message. I think that's bad practice. However, I will make small communications, like, you know, confirm meetings and confirm things like that, because that information, frankly, it's not very yeah, it's not sensitive. So I do think as we move more towards these different forums and platforms, we need to be aware of what is the privacy and how are we protecting everyone. I would be really reluctant to be doing a lot of work over text message if we don't know what the terms of agreement are of that system that you're using.
Yeah, I don't do any kind of screen questions or anything like that by text.
I think people have a lot of the state provided cell phones, and that's, I know I run into that a lot in our work, that they don't have voicemail. They only have so many minutes. And once they exhaust those minutes, but they usually have unlimited text. So, yeah, so that's
Yeah, we were talking over the break, Courtney and I, about voicemail And how voicemail is even this thing that isn't. I get my voicemail messages, in the form of this transcribed text, and I will read that. I really don't listen to voicemails hardly at all anymore. Even if some words are missing, I'll just kind of fill it in sometimes, depending on the communication and, how important it is to be detailed about it. But, even that form of communication is becoming fairly obsolete.
I just wanted to add something from my perspective at a state agency in terms of cell phones is my personal cell phone, if I'm communicating via text message about work business, is considered an open record that is subject to disclosure. So it's very important because some of your parties might be using their work email or their work issued cell phone, or just to be aware of those kind of things.
Because we do get a lot of parents that work for school districts. And they use their school district email.
Yeah, those are definitely open records, despite, efforts to resist that. And so, yeah, there was a period of time when I carried 2 phones and, really never did anything over text message on my business phone that wasn't going to be appropriate for a headline somewhere. Okay, so the main way that I deal with a lot of these issues is, in addition to being deliberate, which I've said a number of times, is just being really upfront with the parties about dealing with those issues. The conversation with the mom about, is this working for you? Is this not working for you? Conversations with the parties about, we're going to do our best to make this system work, and we should talk about, maybe the need for a backup plan if for some reason it doesn't work. Conversations with parties about recording, conversations with parties about, this feels disruptive. I know that having a laptop, you said was important to you because it's the way you take notes, but I feel like, we're not communicating very well. Can we just take a 10-minute break from taking notes and talk with each other for a while? My general approach to mediation is to be as transparent about what I'm doing with the process as I think will be effective for the parties, and I have included, technology considerations into that approach. And then the last one, and I think it's kind of a big one, so I saved it for last, is achieving some kind of balance between what is convenient for the parties, what the parties prefer, balancing that against what we really need to do to protect the process. If I have the sense that something is just not going to work, and I'm not talking even necessarily about it not working like plug in the wall from a technological standpoint, but that it's going to create an impression that I believe may be problematic, even if the parties can't see that up front, that it may kind of evolve into something down the road that could present an obstacle to an agreement. I may resist a suggestion, and I really try to be as respectful of the parties' autonomy as I can in terms of setting up the process and letting them drive, how it plays out. I'm very protective of mediation as an approach because it's my profession. So, I try to be accommodating, but occasionally I will say, I just don't think that's a good idea. Any additional? Yeah.
Yeah, can I add one thing on the video conferencing?
Let me get you the mic so here.
Yeah, on the video conferencing, I think it's a good option if that's what one of the parties requests. But one thing, just from some other experiences that I've had, especially if there's 2 parties involved, is that we really need to make an effort to make sure that the person on the other end is being included within the conversation amongst the others around the table. So, it's real easy for the other people to kind of lose them, and then they might think, well, we're a little biased towards the people.
The monitor, and this is often true, if the monitor is not quite at eye level, if it's up on the wall above whatever that piece of furniture is called that you put the water on.
Right.
hands up? Yeah, yeah, okay. So if the monitor is up a little higher, that person can really disappear from the
Right.
conversation. And that's part of what I mean about being more demonstrative, more deliberate about making sure that person is included, checking in.
Right, there you go.
Can be easy to
Yeah,
forget.
because it's real natural for us to be thinking, we're talking to all these people that are right here.
Sure.
And so
And
we,
it's natural. We're going to
Right.
gravitate towards
That's
the
right.
people in the room as opposed to the, two-dimensional face on the screen.
right,
And so, I've had to, and I've had that both in video conferencing and where someone has participated by telephone. I had one case where the attorney was there with me, but the client was on the telephone, and I, felt, there were occasions when I thought, that went a little fast. The client didn't really have enough of an opportunity to chime in on that idea, because the attorney was looking me right in the eye. So, yeah, it can be problematic, and I think it just requires more effort. There are clearly upsides, but it requires more effort on the part of the neutral.
I think in our mediations, we see more speakerphone participation than we see video participation. Is that all your experience too? Because, for instance, like Wendy Overture from Facets has an entire state she has to cover, so she participates a lot by speakerphone. Attorneys and advocates seem to participate more by speakerphone, but I sort of discourage video participation by a first party, I call them, like a parent or a district person, unless it's absolutely necessary, because our model is to have people in the room as much as possible.
Yeah, I tend to think that the speakerphone is going to give way to the video conferencing. Like I said, there are people that I deal with now who every time we have a phone call or an occasion for a phone call, we do it with Zoom. And it's apparent to me that in that individual's office, that's just kind of a standard approach at this point. Any other thoughts?
My brain's been going all over the place with this, but one of the thoughts that keeps coming back to me is the whole idea of when we're not together physically, the energy that gets lost between people. And we had the presentation on compassion and how a lot of that gets lost because there's not the energy that we now know is really there among us. And probably 10 years ago, I was at a presentation where a man was telling us that we were going to all be working from our homes within the next 5 years. No one was going to come together anymore because technology was going to make it that we didn't have to. And I asked that question of him, was he not concerned that we wouldn't have that energy among each other? And he said, oh, that doesn't matter. And so I asked him then, why are you here? Because he just got done telling us he had a quick run out the door and hop on a plane and go halfway across the country to do another presentation. I said, then why did you come here? Why didn't you just do it video conferencing? And he said, well, I guess I'll have to think about that. But I've thought about that a lot, and this brought it up for me again. And yet, as I've been going through all of this, my brain keeps going to what you said before. This is my stuff, a lot of it. For younger generations, my stuff is not going to be their stuff. And so even when you were talking about leveling where we all are, the environment, my brain was going to, well, maybe it would be better if they were each in a comfortable environment for themselves instead of in where we all have problems. So, it's just going all over the place. So this is really good. Thank you.
Oh, and just to comment on that, the recent party that I had participating via video conferencing, he would not have been able to be present comfortably at the mediation session for the full period of time that we were there. I mean, it would have been somewhat uncomfortable the entire time, and then it would have shortened the mediation session because, his sort of physical endurance was not, just wasn't there. And so, he was able, it was a technique that allowed him to participate, and it worked. We got it done. I mean, there had to be a few more steps taken to get there, but. All right, thanks, everyone.